All right. Good morning, everyone. Just waiting for people to trickle on in here for today's webinar. Can't believe it's already the end of the year here. For anyone who has joined any of our webinars this year, thank you for listening. If this is your first webinar that you're viewing of ours, welcome. We hope you enjoy. My name's Emily Smith. Today I will be joined by Justin Engelmeyer, Vice President at Interlog, Ben Schwingle, International Operations Director at Interlog, and Rachel Thielen, Marketing Manager at Interlog. Today, we will be discussing a lot of things, kind of the Panama Canal crisis and any latest updates with that. We'll also discuss the year-over-year import volumes, and also the Red Sea, the transit disruptions out over there. And we'll end it with some discussion on Chinese New Year. If you guys have any questions, please put them below in the Q&A. We'll be trying to get through those during the webinar, and if we don't, we will reach out to you personally. But on to our first topic, the Panama Canal. Justin, we talked about this topic extensively in last month's webinar. Can you kind of give our viewers kind of if there's any updates on this and kind of what's happening out here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. And good morning, everyone. So last month during our webinar was one of the first big announcement as to how this was going to affect everyone. And they had a scenario going out forward of this is going to be the restriction. This was what it's going to look like moving forward here. And they were reducing the amount of vessels that could go through it month after month after month. And I think somewhere in February, it was going to be reduced down to 17 or 16 to 18 vessels, something like that, versus the 36 that were going through it before. There is a little bit of good news here. I believe there's been a little more rainfall happening throughout December. And now they've actually lightened the restriction to 24 vessels going through it versus they were supposed to have in January 20 going through it. So they actually are going to increase it from 22, which is right now, to 24. So that does lighten the burden a little bit here. And I don't think that it's enough for us to, at least from what I've seen and read about and heard about, I don't think it's enough to completely change course and say, okay, good, we're out of it and we don't have to worry about it. We still are having at this moment, in January when it's going to increase to 24, that's still 12 vessels less per day. And as volumes do start to pick up, I think you're going to see that get, the effect come into play more often. But I don't know as the dry season hits if it's going to worsen and they're going to lower it. There hasn't been a whole lot of communication on what's going to happen other than instead of the prediction of 20 vessels in January, it's now 24. So we'll have to wait and see about that. Ben, what have you been hearing from the carriers?
Well, let me put it in the perspective of the route planners' minds.
Sure.
You're seeing that reduction, and there's a bottleneck happening in the Panama Canal, clearly. But how do they choose which ships go through and at what rate? And how long do you wait for your ship to go through before deciding we should unload containers on the West Coast terminal of the Panama Canal instead of going through and onto the East Coast? If you unload them on the West Coast of the Panama Canal, another ship going through later can pick them up and continue them on, creating a transshipment point. That chart on the top left in gray kind of lists out the different types of vessels that might go through it. Our viewers might not have thought about waiting their turns. If we're just talking container vessels, where do they get priority over project cargo on the railroad vessels or LPG? It's critical to infrastructure. A lot of thought and independent agendas try and take priority over each other through that canal. So that there's a bottleneck happening and a ripple effect back towards the supply area of the East Asia region.
So Ben, can you explain or expand a little bit on who might benefit from transloading or transshipping on the West Coast and then go through the Panama Canal?
Any ships that need to make the rotation back towards the East Asia to pick up more containers in the Chinese or East Asian ports.
Okay, so they're going to be adding more routes that would include a transship point on the West Coast versus going through the Panama Canal. So it might lengthen the transit time by going through the Panama Canal, but it's still an option.
Yes. Yes.
Got it. So yeah, I think again, Ben, and what we discussed last month was we have to start thinking about what the options are. And last month, another option that hasn't come up much was to go through the Suez Canal. And so we're sitting here and we're talking about the Panama Canal. And we're talking about how we have the lack of rainfall, the El Nino, causing this natural effect, which is causing some disruption in our market, in our industry. And now we have the Suez Canal, which was going to be an alternate route to get to the East Coast versus going through the Panama Canal. And it's only about a week longer, 10 days longer transit time, but you could get similar pricing. Now we have disruption in the Suez Canal. And so let's discuss the Suez Canal and how we're going to, what that's working through and how we're going around that.
Sure. But we're back up one slide, Emily. We should touch on the point that this is a natural restriction happening in the Panama Canal. And though Justin brought some silver lining to it, it's month long. And the long-term projections for decreased rainfall probably will hold true. We'll probably see prolonged decrease in number of vessels going through the Panama Canal. That's not going to resolve itself in the short term. Although we like to see these slight increases, we're still one third below the vessel passage that we'd like to see. So just to point out, natural restriction here in the Panama Canal that we'll be monitoring and reporting on, switching to a man-made restriction in the Red Sea and Suez Canal, which may be prolonged even more than the natural.
Right, the
Also
Suez
new.
Canal. Let's discuss how what's going on with that. I know that you're getting an earful from people from our partners overseas and stuff. Because of the attacks on the vessels, there were I believe 8 attacks on attacks on 8 different vessels last week. And people carriers are starting to pull their vessels off that lane and rerouting it down underneath Africa.
And for anyone that hasn't heard what these attacks are, the Red Sea goes through to the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal, passing by countries like Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Egypt, and on the east side, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And it's the Yemeni rebels of a clan called the Houthi that are firing on the ships. The Houthi are backed by the Iranians, and the Iranians are also linked with Hamas. So it's really ignited by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is the Houthis' stand on it right now to attack the vessels in the Red Sea because of their alliance with Iran and the Palestinians, Hamas specifically. Okay. So that being said, that's why these attacks are occurring, and announcements are coming out just in the last couple of days and hours saying carriers are rerouting vessels southward around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa. This happened, if you remember, was it a year and a half ago, when a vessel was blocking Suez Canal and started to turn around and go towards the Cape of Good Hope, but that ship was actually freed up and the passage was cleared. So ships that had started to go towards South Africa turned around and figured it was actually quicker to U-turn and come back through the Suez. That does not look likely right now. I think we're going to continue to have to reroute and make plans for a prolonged schedule and ripple effect towards the buyer side, the importer side on the United States and Europe, especially Europe. That's where I'm hearing a lot of concern because all of their imports from Asia and India come through the Suez Canal.
Well, I read something that 30% of container cargo goes on this route here. And so it's affecting quite a bit. And from what we've learned in the past is that ripple effect can start to affect everything else. And we don't necessarily know what that looks like right now. It's just one more glitch in the system right here that's causing something that we have to be aware of. You know, whether this is, you know, affects your route exactly or not, it could affect it with congestion or something elsewhere.
That's right. Take a look at the trade lanes around the world that one ship might take. You go from Shanghai, the Suez Canal, pass through to Rotterdam, load more containers and come to New York with European cargo. If that ship is bypassing the Suez Canal and taking at least a week more to go around the southern tip of Africa, it means it'll arrive to New York a week late with European cargo. And compounding that with all the vessels trying to do the same route, disrupting their weekly schedules, it means bad news for European exporters to the US. It's certainly bad news for European importers from Asia. Therefore, if you're planning and you're thinking of just your European imports being safe, you gotta reconsider and double check the options that are presented to you by your freight forwarder.
So let's go over this, Ben, here. So most of our customers here in the US have cargo either coming from the Asia lanes, Trans-Pacific lanes coming into the US, or stuff from Europe coming into the US. That's what's going to be affected by what we're discussing right now here, either going to the East Coast, West Coast. So let's walk through a couple scenarios as to, I understand we should be in conversation with each and every single one of these customers, and we are, and we've been making those phone calls and talking about their specific needs at this time and what they should be looking at going forward. But if we were just able to say, all right, someone coming into the West Coast or East Coast, coming out of these lanes, what would we do right now? Right now, I think the Panama Canal is still an option, even though it's 24 vessels a day versus the 36. You know, so on and so forth. But if you could, you're the one dealing with the carriers here, tell these people what maybe some of your recommendations would be right now, what they should be doing right now. And obviously then they still have to have further communication as things change and what could happen in the future.
Yeah. Always have alternate and contingency plans for your shipping. From East Asia to the United States, whether you're in the inland or even the East Coast, consider routing with transload and trucking on the West Coast if you're not doing rail already. Besides having alternate contingency plans, stick with the known method, but relay information to your consumers. Trust in what we've done the last few years is give bad news and let them know you're working on a plan or you'll continue updating them, because we will see higher costs as shipping takes longer routes. There's just a higher cost for shipping now. And we're going to see somewhat of a balance of vessel capacity because the number of days increases that it can take or that requires to transit the both oceans, the Pacific and Atlantic. Does that clarify that, Justin?
Yeah, and you know, Ben, so we've seen how certain carriers have already what do they call it? The PCS, whatever surcharge, or whatever, the Panama Canal surcharge, essentially. People are already proposing that it's already going to happen in January. And from what I can tell, even though the number of vessels allowed to go through January is more than they originally predicted, I don't see that. I haven't seen them back off on those surcharges. Is that correct? So we're already seeing that there are the surcharges are going to be there. They're planning on charging more to go through that. And that's even with them saying, hey, it's not quite as bad as we thought it would be.
That's true. A lot of listeners will remember last summer where the carriers were casting out these general rate increases, which happens every summer. Normally up $100 or $200 per container. Well, they were saying $800 or $1,200 every month, and then they'd retract it.
Right.
To somewhere around $100, $200. And you can't help but feel, I wonder they're doing the same thing right now. Taking advantage of the natural increased season before Chinese New Year, exaggerated by the Panama Canal shortage of water, and just throwing out big numbers. But there is a short 60-day period right now between now and Chinese New Year where containers have to move through, right? They have to load ships and move. So I feel that, and the numbers Justin's talking about is $1,200, $1,500 per container. You're talking about 50% increase or more. That probably could stick to a greater degree than it was this last summer.
Right, and I think that another thing that they're going to pull off of is the disruption in the Red Sea. If that continues, if that's there and people aren't able to use the Suez Canal because of the Red Sea attacks, then again, that's just one more avenue that people can't utilize and aren't going to use. Therefore, it restricts capacity, and you're going to have less stuff available. So, um, yeah, I guess it's dependent upon where you're located, where you're trying to bring stuff into, but just know your options and start having an understanding of what you're looking at here and know it before you're in that situation of need.
Yep, it's well said.
All right. Well, we do have some polls for you guys. Those who are watching this on LinkedIn, just put it in the chat for us to see. But we appreciate any feedback you guys have on these polls. You should see it pop up here. And yeah, if this kind of helps us know what kind of topics we can talk about in the future. So any feedback on these, we will consider for January's webinar. But Justin, Ben, do we want to touch on Chinese New Year?
Sure. Ben, I'll let you take away with this. Everything that I know about it, it seems like it should be a normal, typical Chinese New Year event, and however, it's going to be a little bit lighter. There's not quite as much pent-up demand, is what I'm hearing from the customer side. But what are you hearing from the carrier side, and what your expectations are?
Same normal operations as every Chinese New Year, ignoring the 2 or 3 years during the COVID pandemic where factories were still producing and still having terminal operations because there was such demand for cargo and shipping. So do expect factories to close right there on February 9th and not resume shipping or loading trucks or any of that for at least until the 15th, perhaps even until the 20th of February. Make sure you're talking with your supplier and getting bookings that in-gate at least load the trucks before the 9th. See how the 6th, 7th, and 8th, that is going to be a really busy time for all terminals and your suppliers. So if you can't make the loading the week before, at least have a booking in hand that will allow you to get the container loaded the first part of that week. And if you're not confident in it, talk with Justin or me. We'll get communication going with your supplier right now, 50 days ahead of time, to make sure that's all discussed and the expectation is set.
Well, and I think it's a fair point, Ben. I think that right now we've been, after going through the pandemic, we're so used to having everyone's planning things out. People have been more communicative with their suppliers and really trying to push to make sure that they get everything. But it might be with a little bit of the lull that we've had for 7 months or 8 months, however long you want to say that is. But with that in mind, I think people might have been lulled into some complacency that we don't need to push things out as much. And I do think regardless, Chinese New Year is Chinese New Year. And as you're alluding to, that 6th, 7th, and 8th, those departures, I mean, those are tough to come by.
Mm-hmm.
And if you need something, it's not what we would advise to be pushing it out those days.
This is where you may end up using your alternate or contingency plans. If you're in the interior of the United States or on the East Coast, those vessels departing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday that week or loading those days are going to be hit with restrictions or fewer containers going through the Panama Canal. So where they're already at high demand, it's going to be increased. If you're at the point where you're looking for an alternate plan, those vessels will be overbooked. Consider going through the west coast of the transloaded trucking, that cargo.
Exactly.
That's what I'll head on Chinese New Year. Until next month.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben and Justin, for all your insight. Next Coffee and Cargo is going to be January 17th, 10 a.m. Central Time. I did add all of our emails on here, so if you guys do want to reach out to any of us, please do so. We'd be happy to answer any questions or discuss any further topics too. But we do send out a recap email tomorrow, just with more additional information on what we went over, and a few other current events will be on there as well. So make sure to take a look at that tomorrow. But thank you guys for joining, and we look forward to seeing you guys next month.